There is a moment when an empath finally stops trying, and almost nobody recognizes it for what it is. They do not always scream. They do not necessarily expose you, punish you, or demand that you understand what you have done. Sometimes they become strangely calm. The person who once explained everything suddenly explains nothing. The person who gave endless chances stops asking for one more. And the person who spent so much energy protecting your feelings begins protecting their own. That is when the consequences begin. Because breaking an empath does not simply end their willingness to give. It changes the way they see you, themselves, and every relationship that comes after you. Most people misunderstand what happens when a deeply caring person reaches their limit. They imagine revenge, they imagine anger, they imagine some dramatic moment where everything explodes and the empath finally fights back. But the most painful consequence is often much quieter. The empath stops expecting anything from you. And when someone stops expecting, they also stop negotiating. They stop waiting for your potential to become reality. They stop translating your excuses into reasons. They stop turning your inconsistency into something they can forgive. What looked like unconditional patience was never an unlimited supply. It was a choice they kept making because they believed the connection mattered. Think about the person who always noticed when your voice changed. They knew when something was wrong before you admitted it. They remembered details you mentioned months ago. They could sense tension in a room before anyone else acknowledged it. When you were overwhelmed, they made space for you. When you were distant, they wondered what they had done wrong. When you hurt them, they searched for explanations before they searched for blame. This is what makes the breaking point so difficult to recognize. A caring person can absorb an astonishing amount of disappointment while still appearing loving. But every unanswered effort leaves a mark. Every promise that changes nothing teaches them something. Every apology followed by the same behavior teaches them something else. And every time they have to beg for the basic consideration they freely give to everyone around them, another piece of emotional trust disappears. The first consequence is not that they leave. It is that they begin watching instead of hoping. This distinction changes everything. In the beginning, they interpret your behavior generously. They think maybe you are stressed, maybe you are afraid, maybe you do not know how deeply this affects me. Maybe if I explain it differently, you will understand. Hope keeps them emotionally invested, but after enough repetition, hope becomes observation. They stop asking why you behaved a certain way and start asking whether the behavior keeps happening. That is the first shift. You are no longer being judged by what you promise. You are being understood by what you repeatedly do. And once a person reaches that stage, dramatic promises become almost meaningless. They have heard words before. What they are looking for now is evidence. This is why one of the most dangerous mistakes you can make after hurting an empath is assuming that an apology automatically resets the relationship. An apology can open a door, but consistency is what keeps that door open. If the same wound is created again and again, eventually the apology itself becomes part of the pattern. The empath no longer hears, "I am sorry." They hear, "This cycle is beginning again." Then comes the second consequence, emotional rationing. The warmth that once seemed effortless becomes selective. They still care, but they stop giving unlimited access to that care. They answer when they have the energy. They stop rushing to solve every crisis. They stop volunteering emotional labor nobody asked them to protect themselves from. You may notice shorter conversations, fewer questions, fewer spontaneous gestures, or a strange absence of urgency. And this is where many people make their final mistake. They think the empath has become cold. No, the empath has become careful. There is a difference. Coldness says, I do not care about you. Careful says, I care, but I finally understand that caring without boundaries is destroying me. That distinction matters because the person you broke may still love you. They may still wish you well. They may still remember beautiful moments. But love is no longer enough to make them ignore what experience has taught them. The third consequence is deeper. They begin trusting patterns more than potential. Before the breaking point, they may have loved the person you could become. They saw your wounds, your fears, your unfinished growth, and they believed patience could help you reach a better version of yourself. After repeated disappointment, that belief changes. They stop asking who you might become and start looking at who you consistently choose to be. That is brutal because potential can survive almost anything. Reality cannot. A promise can say tomorrow will be different. A pattern says tomorrow will probably look like yesterday. And when an empath finally believes the pattern, you cannot argue them back into hope. This is why the consequences of breaking an empath are not always visible immediately. Sometimes the person is still beside you. They still answer your messages. They still attend family events. They may even smile. But internally, something has already changed. The relationship is no longer being carried by hope. It is being evaluated by reality. And then comes the consequence most people fear only after it is too late: indifference. Anger still means you matter. Anger still spends energy. Someone who argues with you is still asking to be understood. Someone who is hurt is still emotionally connected to the possibility that things could improve, but indifference asks for nothing. It does not need an explanation. It does not need revenge. It does not need the final word. It simply stops investing. And that is why the quiet departure of a deeply caring person can feel more brutal than any argument. But there is another side. If you are the empath, breaking does not mean you are permanently damaged. It can become the moment you learn that compassion without boundaries becomes self-abandonment. You can remain kind without remaining available. You can forgive without reopening the same door. You can love someone and still decide their behavior no longer belongs in your life. And if you are the person who broke that empath, understand this: greatest consequence may not be that they hate you. It may be that they learn to live without you. Once peace feels better than begging for emotional safety, they stop confusing suffering with love. They may remember you with compassion, but they no longer need you. The fourth consequence is one people rarely anticipate. The empath becomes harder to manipulate, not because they suddenly become cruel, but because pain has taught them to recognize what their compassion once concealed. Before they were broken, they may have searched for the wounded child inside your behavior. Afterward, they start noticing the adult making choices. They can still understand why you act the way you do, but understanding is no longer an excuse. That is a profound psychological shift. Empathy remains, but self-betrayal ends. This is where the relationship changes. The empath no longer asks, "What happened to you?" before asking, "What is happening to me?" If only one person is constantly adapting, the relationship is not balanced. It is being maintained by one person's exhaustion. And once they recognize that imbalance, something surprising happens. They stop trying to convince you that their pain is real. This is the fifth consequence: the end of emotional persuasion. A person who still hopes will explain. They will give examples. They will describe exactly what hurt them. They will tell you what they need. They may repeat themselves because they believe the right words could finally unlock your understanding. But when an empath reaches emotional exhaustion, they often stop making the case. Not because their pain disappeared, but because they have realized that someone who genuinely wants to understand does not require an endless courtroom presentation. That silence can be mistaken for acceptance. It is not. It is exhaustion. And exhaustion has a deadline. Imagine someone who has spent years knocking on the same locked door. Every time the door opens slightly, they believe there is still hope. Or they explain, they wait, they forgive, they return, but eventually they stop knocking. From the other side, it may look like nothing happened. The hallway is quiet, there is no argument, there is no dramatic goodbye, but the person who is knocking has already walked away. That makes emotional breaking difficult to reverse. You cannot repair a relationship with someone who is still standing at the door by simply promising to open it. You have to understand why they stopped knocking in the first place. The sixth consequence is that the empath becomes extremely sensitive to inconsistency. Before, they may have focused on your intentions. After being hurt repeatedly, they focus on alignment. Do your words match your behavior? Does your affection appear only when you fear losing access to them? Do you change for 3 days and then return to the same habits? Do you apologize because you understand their pain or because you want the discomfort of the conflict to disappear? These questions become almost automatic. And once the empath starts noticing inconsistencies, they cannot easily unsee them. This is not about becoming suspicious of everyone. It is about finally trusting evidence. The person who once gave you the benefit of the doubt now gives patterns the benefit of attention. The consequence is not punishment. It is accountability. Another shift happens quietly. The empath begins rebuilding their identity outside the relationship. This may be the most powerful consequence of all. When someone spends years organizing their emotional world around another person's needs, they can slowly forget what they want, what they enjoy, and what peace feels like. Breaking forces them to discover those things again. At first, the silence may feel empty. Then it starts feeling peaceful. They sleep without checking whether you are upset. They make plans without wondering how you will react. They enjoy ordinary moments without preparing themselves for the next emotional emergency. They discover that their nervous system can exist without constantly scanning another person's mood. And that discovery changes everything. Because once someone experiences peace after chaos, chaos no longer feels romantic. Once they experience reciprocity, one-sided love becomes impossible to mistake for devotion. Once they experience boundaries, guilt can no longer control them as easily. That is why the consequences can appear long after the relationship ends. The empath may become more selective about who receives their deepest energy. They may stop rescuing people who refuse to rescue themselves. They may stop confusing being needed with being loved. They may stop believing that patience means tolerating the same wound indefinitely. The most painful consequence for the person who broke them is this: someone else may eventually receive the healed version of the person they once took for granted. Not the version who begged to be heard, not the version who explained everything, not the version who kept giving chances, the version who knows their worth without needing someone else to confirm it. That person is not necessarily bitter. They may be happier, softer, and more compassionate than before, but their compassion now has a gate around it. Access is earned through consistency, respect, and reciprocity. So if you are wondering whether you have already broken an empath in your life, do not look for hatred. Look for the disappearance of emotional effort. Look for the person who used to reach towards you and now simply lets distance exist. Look for the conversations that became shorter, the questions that disappeared, and the future plans that are no longer discussed. Those are not always signs that someone stopped caring. Sometimes they mean someone finally started caring about themselves. And if you still have a chance to repair what was damaged, do not make the mistake of trying to recreate the old version of the relationship. The old version depended on their unlimited patience. You need something healthier now. Start with responsibility. Name the behavior without excuses. Change it without demanding applause. Accept that trust may return slowly. Most importantly, allow their boundaries to exist without treating those boundaries as rejection. Because the deepest consequence of breaking an empath is not that they hurt you back, it is that they eventually realize they never needed to. That is the real consequence. The seventh consequence is that the empath learns to distinguish connection from familiarity. This sounds simple, but it changes who they allow into their life. Before being broken, they may have mistaken emotional intensity for intimacy. If someone needed them constantly, they felt important. If someone shared their wounds, they felt trusted. If someone created chaos and then came back seeking comfort, they felt indispensable. After enough pain, that equation changes. They begin asking a different question. Does this relationship actually nourish me, or does it simply give me a role to perform? That question is powerful because it removes the emotional reward of being needed. An empath can survive without being everyone's rescuer. They can allow another adult to experience consequences without rushing in to soften them. They can watch someone struggle without immediately assuming responsibility for the struggle. And when they discover that other people can solve their own problems, something inside them becomes lighter. This is where the person who broke them may become confused. They may think, "You used to care so much. What happened?" The answer is not that the empath suddenly developed a heart of stone. The answer is that they finally understood the difference between compassion and responsibility. You can care about someone's pain without becoming responsible for fixing it. You can understand someone's trauma without accepting their harmful behavior. You can forgive someone without giving them unlimited access. And you can love someone while deciding that proximity to them is no longer healthy for you. Those distinctions are often learned through pain. The eighth consequence is that the empath becomes less impressed by emotional intensity. Dramatic declarations that once felt powerful begin to lose their effect. A sudden flood of affection after weeks of neglect no longer feels romantic. A desperate promise made only after they threaten to leave no longer feels reassuring. They have learned to watch what happens after the emotional moment ends. This is why consistency becomes more attractive than chemistry. A calm person who keeps their word can feel safer than someone who creates extraordinary emotional highs and devastating lows. A simple check-in can mean more than 1,000 promises. A repeated respectful action can rebuild what a beautiful speech never could. The empath has learned that love is not measured by the intensity of the apology. It is measured by the absence of the behavior that made the apology necessary. That realization can be brutal for someone who depended on emotional emergencies to keep the relationship alive. Because now the old cycle stops working. You cannot hurt them and then use affection to erase the hurt. You cannot disappear and then return with a dramatic confession expecting everything to reset. You cannot repeatedly cross a boundary and then call their boundary a lack of love. The rules have changed. And the person who broke the empath may discover that the person they once had access to is gone, even though the same face is still standing in front of them. The ninth consequence is internal peace. This is the part that nobody sees from the outside. The empath may spend months grieving what happened, questioning themselves, remembering conversations, wondering whether they could have communicated better. They may even miss the person who hurt them. Healing does not mean forgetting. It means remembering without allowing the memory to control the present. They begin redirecting the energy they once spent monitoring another person's emotions toward their own life. They reconnect with friends. They pursue neglected interests. They become comfortable being alone. They discover that solitude is not the same thing as loneliness. And perhaps most importantly, they begin trusting their own perception again. Because being repeatedly dismissed can make a caring person doubt themselves. They start thinking, maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I expected too much. Maybe I should have been more understanding. But healing teaches them to ask a better question. Would I tell someone I love to accept this treatment? If the answer is no, they eventually understand that the standard applies to them too. That is when the consequence becomes permanent. Not because they hate you, not because they want revenge, but because they have rebuilt a relationship with themselves that they are no longer willing to sacrifice for someone else's approval. And if you are the person who caused the damage, this is where you need to understand something difficult. You cannot demand access to the healed person using the memories of the person they used to be. You cannot say, but you were always there for me, as though their past generosity created a permanent obligation. Their previous availability was a gift, not a contract. If you genuinely regret what happened, prove it through behavior. Accept that they may never trust you the way they once did. Accept that forgiveness does not guarantee reconciliation. Accept that your remorse does not erase their experience. Real accountability does not ask, when will you get over it? It asks, what can I change so I never make someone feel this way again? That is the difference between guilt and growth. And perhaps that is the final lesson hidden inside this entire pattern. Breaking an empath does not create a monster, it creates a boundary. The person who once gave without limits learns limits now. The person who once explained everything learns silence. The person who once believed potential learns patterns. The person who once feared losing someone learns to fear losing themselves. And once that lesson becomes part of them, they carry it into every future relationship. So if someone in your life is becoming quieter, do not automatically assume they are being difficult. Ask yourself what happened before the silence. Ask how many times they tried to communicate. Ask how many times they forgave the same behavior. Ask how often they showed up while you assumed they always would. Because people rarely become distant without a history. Distance is often the final chapter of a conversation that started long before anyone noticed. And sometimes the consequence of breaking a deeply caring person is not that they destroy your life, it is that they rebuild theirs without you. But there is one final consequence that deserves more attention than all the others, because it explains why some people never get another chance with the empath they once wounded. The empath eventually stops measuring the relationship by how much history exists between two people and starts measuring it by how safe the present feels. Years together no longer automatically outweigh repeated disrespect. Memories no longer excuse patterns. Familiarity no longer earns unlimited access. The past may explain why they stayed, but it no longer determines why they should remain. This is where the empath becomes emotionally independent. And emotional independence can look surprisingly ordinary. They stop checking their phone, hoping you will change your behavior. They stop rehearsing conversations in their head. They stop wondering how to say something without upsetting you. They stop monitoring your mood before deciding whether they are allowed to have their own. They wake up one morning and realize that your reaction is no longer controlling the temperature of their entire day. That is freedom. But freedom can look like rejection to someone who is accustomed to having emotional access. The person who once received immediate responses may suddenly receive a response when the empath is actually available. The person who once expected forgiveness may discover that forgiveness now comes with distance. The person who once assumed the relationship would survive anything may finally realize that the relationship had conditions all along. Those conditions were simply never spoken because the empath believed love would make them obvious. It did not. So the empath learns to speak them. I cannot continue this. That behavior is not acceptable to me. I need space. Or I am not willing to repeat this conversation. Those sentences may sound harsh coming from someone who once explained themselves gently for hours, but they are not necessarily cruelty. They are boundaries finally given a voice. And here is where the consequences become especially uncomfortable for the person who caused the damage. You may discover that the empath's greatest transformation has nothing to do with becoming harder. They may actually become softer with themselves. They sleep more peacefully. They stop apologizing for needing rest. They stop feeling guilty for saying no. They stop treating every disappointed reaction from another person as evidence that they have done something wrong. They begin to understand that being a good person does not require being endlessly accessible. That realization changes their relationships. They begin choosing people who reciprocate naturally rather than people who need constant reminders. They become attracted to emotional stability rather than emotional intensity. They notice whether someone listens when they speak. They notice whether someone's kindness survives inconvenience. They notice whether respect disappears when that person becomes angry. In other words, they become difficult to fool, not impossible to hurt, not incapable of trusting, just more conscious. And that may be the most brutal consequence of all for anyone who believed the empath's kindness meant they would always be easy to return to. The empath remembers, not necessarily every detail, but the pattern. They remember how it felt to be ignored when they needed support. They remember what happened when they finally expressed disappointment. They remember whether you became defensive or curious. They remember whether your apology lasted longer than the conversation. They remember whether your behavior changed when there was nothing left to lose. Those memories become information. And information changes decisions. This is why trying to recreate the old relationship can fail, even when both people still have feelings. The empath is no longer making decisions from the same emotional position. They have information they did not have before. They know what the relationship cost them. They know what happens when they ignore their instincts. They know what happens when they give another chance before seeing genuine change. You cannot make them unknow what they now know. And that is why consequences are not always dramatic. Sometimes the consequence is simply that the person becomes unavailable for the version of the relationship you were offering. They may still be willing to meet you somewhere healthier, but they will not return to the place where they disappeared inside someone else's needs. If you are watching this and realizing that you may have done this to someone, do not waste the realization by turning it into self-hatred. Shame can become another form of avoidance. The useful response is responsibility. Look honestly at what you did. Look at what you repeatedly failed to do. Look at the moments when someone was asking for connection and you gave them an explanation instead. Look at the times when their pain was inconvenient, so you called it overreaction. Look at the times when they forgave you and you interpreted forgiveness as permission to repeat the behavior. Then understand that repairing trust requires more than feeling bad. It requires becoming different. And becoming different is not something you announce. It is something another person eventually experiences. Maybe you start listening without preparing your defense. Maybe you keep a promise even when nobody reminds you. Maybe you stop making someone prove that their feelings are legitimate. Maybe you learn that consistency is not glamorous, but it is what makes love feel safe. And if they still choose to leave, you must respect that too. Because real accountability includes accepting consequences you cannot control. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do for someone you hurt is to stop asking them to comfort you about the pain you caused. Let them heal. Let them become someone you no longer have access to. Let their boundary teach you what your apologies could not. And if you are the empath who has been broken, remember this before you leave. Your softness was never the problem. Your ability to care deeply was never the weakness. The lesson is not to become heartless. The lesson is to stop giving your heart to people who repeatedly prove they do not know how to hold it. You do not have to become less compassionate. You have to become more discerning. You do not have to stop forgiving. You have to stop confusing forgiveness with permission. You do not have to hate the person who hurt you. You simply have to stop volunteering for the same wound. Because the final consequence of being broken is also the beginning of becoming whole. The empath learns that peace is not boring. It is precious. They learn that consistency is more valuable than chemistry. They learn that boundaries do not destroy love. They reveal whether love was healthy enough to survive them. And eventually, they understand something they could not understand while they were still trying to save the relationship. Sometimes losing someone is not the tragedy. Sometimes the tragedy was losing yourself while trying to keep them. So when an empath finally walks away, do not assume the silence means they never cared. Sometimes silence is proof that they cared for far too long. They gave explanations, chances, patience, understanding, and hope until there was almost nothing left to give. And when they finally stop, the consequence is not revenge. It is reality. They stop chasing. They stop rescuing. They stop waiting. They stop asking you to become someone you have repeatedly chosen not to be. And then they move forward. Not because you meant nothing, but because they finally understand that they mean something too. That is the point where the broken empath becomes a different kind of person. Not colder, not crueler, not incapable of love, just awake. And once they are awake, the relationship can never return to what it was. Because the person who once abandoned themselves to keep you has finally chosen themselves instead.